How the heck does falling work in D&D? You may be thinking this is an obvious question with a simple answer. Obviously, if you fall a certain distance, you take a certain amount of damage, unless you're a monk or you've cast Featherfall, right? You see, I've done the legwork to figure out what 5e says and doesn't say about falling. And make sure to stick around to the end for some helpful steals from other editions to plug the many, many gaps. With that said, let's drop right in. If you're a habitual Dungeon Master of 5th edition, like I am, you know one thing about falling. For every 10 feet a character falls, they take another d6 when they land, up to 20 d6, and they land prone. But if, like me, you use this rule every so often, I'm sure some pretty challenging questions have come up. What if the character has fallen into water? Or mud? Or a field of cotton overflowing with duck-down pillows? Well, by the rules as written, each of these falls does the same amount of bludgeoning damage, wholly dependent upon the height fallen from. Despite the fact that this goes against common sense. I mean, humans habitually jump into water from heights larger than 10 feet. And falling onto pillows hurts a heck of a lot less than solid rock. Just a couple of observations from my personal life experience. There's also another problem, which rears its head more often in high-level games or games with flying airships or dizzying walkways over great chasmic spans. We know what happens when you fall. But when do you fall? And how fast? Well, Xanathar's Guide to Everything gives us our official answer for the second of those queries. On page 77, it suggests adopting an optional rule that states, when you fall from great height, you instantly descend up to 500 feet. If you're still falling on your next turn, you descend up to 500 feet at the end of that turn. This process continues until the fall ends. The cool thing about this rule is that it almost answers our question on when you fall as well. Instantly. The less cool thing is that instantly is a strange term to use here. See, instantly, to me, indicates that the now falling creature has no time to react to their new status as falling. Which kind of begs the question, how is Featherfall supposed to work? This is a spell whose entire existence is to stop people dying from falling. Yet a strict reading of this optional rule from Xanathar's Guide to Everything raises at least a little conflict. Imagine this. Your ally is pushed off a flying airship by an enemy, and you see them begin to fall. The ground is 1,000 feet below you. When they were pushed, your ally was 20 feet away from you. By the optional rule, your ally instantly falls 500 feet, because the fall is triggered when you fall from a great height. However, you can cast Featherfall, which takes one reaction, used when a creature within 60 feet of you falls. Your ally did certainly fall. But are they within 60 feet of you? Most sane DMs would abide by the specificity doctrine here, allowing a specific spell to override the general rule about falling. But it could also technically be ruled that your ally is already 500 feet away from you by the time you're able to use your reaction to cast Featherfall, meaning they're already out of the range of your spell. Now all this seems to be silly semantics. After all, if almost every GM would allow Featherfall to function there, we can take instantly, in this case, to mean very quickly indeed, certainly not giving a full turn of combat. unless I'm mistaken, this also means that any fall under 500 feet deals instantaneous damage, unless you're able to react to it. Which does make sense from a physics perspective, but is an absolutely brutal way to instantly kill an enemy or a player character with absolutely no chance of any salvific action, as long as one specific spell is not prepared. You may be wondering why I've spent so much time debating the semantics of an optional rule. That's because it is one of 3 rules in the entirety of 5th edition that deals in some way with falling. We've gone through the first rule, and this optional rule, so what's the third? Well, that rule simply states that if you are flying and you lose the ability to continue flying, you start falling. Seriously, there are fewer rules for falling in 5th edition than there are for drowning. There is no modification for the relative softness of the impact point, little guidance on how fast people actually fall, and a rather anti-fun implication that 20d6 damage can be dealt instantly to any character, without that pushed target ever getting a turn. It's a very bare bones mechanic that is often house ruled at most tables, which is almost always a sign of a rule making very little situational sense. So, how can we make a coherent falling system that makes sense? Because it does come up more often than you'd think. First, let's discuss the falling person. It doesn't make terribly much sense for a falling character to get a full turn within the first 500 feet. I mean, this is D&D's attempt at simulating a sort of terminal velocity style speed over 6 seconds, even though it must be noted that a creature in the real world doesn't achieve terminal velocity as soon as they start falling. However, I will say, for falls above 500 feet, the Xanathar's optional rule does make a lot of sense. It gives characters a turn to try something as they're free falling. Personally, for falls that are between 200 and 500 feet, I like to give the character a chance to do something very minor. To grab an item from an available holster, to try and shout something, or try and cover their vital areas as best as possible. This almost always fails to affect the actual damage in any meaningful sense, but a very clever and creative idea that can be effected in a very short amount of time might net a player a slight reduction in damage, if they're very lucky. This is to alleviate some of that unfairness that falling 499 feet allows a character no input, whereas falling 501 feet allows an entire turn just before the individual hits the floor. Again, by rules as written. I believe one of the most interesting falling rules in D&D's history comes actually from 4th edition, which governs what happens when a character that can fly nonetheless starts to fall. Now, usually in 5th edition, this doesn't come up, as creatures that are flying start to fall as soon as they have no flying speed. But I would like to extend this rule to characters who could fly, but for some reason are choosing not to. They've not been forced to be unable to use their wings anymore. They were, for example, a flying character walking along a cliff edge, or a character with fly cast upon them, nonetheless taking a stroll, again, out by the cliffs. 4th edition actually subtracts the available fly speed, which for a creature whose wings are grappled is 0, but for these edge cases, maybe in the 60s, detracts that fly speed from the distance fallen, assuming that the character is flapping their wings and trying their absolute best to slow their momentum using their wings. So, a character who tumbles off a cliff still with a 60-foot fly speed inherent to them, might take 1d6 damage from a 70-foot fall. But the main reason I would consider using this is that it alleviates those infuriating discussions of, oh, no, I definitely would have been flying there, I just didn't say it and describe myself walking earlier on, but I would have been flying there, honest. 4th edition also provides a benefit to those who are trained in acrobatics while falling. It's a nice, niche benefit, but it seems like a reasonable import for 5th edition. The rule states that a proficient character can make an acrobatics check as a free action to try and lessen the impact of the fall. 1/2 of this acrobatics check, rounded down, is subtracted from the falling damage. I like both of these rules, as they provide clear, simple rulings for edge cases, so that your game doesn't get bogged down by arguing over what ruling you end up pulling out of your arse. Is your player arguing that they can tuck and roll to try and reduce the damage from this fall? Let them make that check. Realistically, it's only going to end up negating maybe 6 to 10 points of damage, but it is going to make your players feel awesome. 3.5e helps us as well, as we can convert one of their rules to help us make sense of falling. Firstly, if a character decides to jump off a height between 10 and 20 feet, that damage still happens but is considered non-lethal. This is a very minor change, but can be the difference between a player complaining and not complaining about the verisimilitude of your game. Now, non-lethal damage in 3.5 works a little differently to 5th edition, and frankly it's a little complicated. So I would recommend just treating this as a non-lethal blow. Not making your player roll death saves, but rather stating you are unconscious on 0 hit points. Assuming that the fall does actually reduce them to 0. A more impactful change from 3.5 discusses what happens when you fall onto various different surfaces. For this, we can pretty much rip this rule straight from 3.5e's reference document. It is as follows. Falls onto yielding surfaces, like soft ground or mud, also convert the first 1d6 damage to non-lethal. This non-lethal conversion stacks with the intentional jumping or falling rules from earlier, meaning that a character jumping from, say, 25 feet up into mud is going to be taking 2d6 bludgeoning damage, as usual, but it will be non-lethal bludgeoning damage, which might save your squishy level 1 wizard from having to make death saves from jumping off a cliff into a big pile of mud. But what about water? Sure, a fall from 500 feet into water should absolutely be dealing, well, 20d6 damage. But on the other hand, falling from a small height into water should probably be fine. After all, most humans can survive a 30-foot drop into water without risking death. Well, again, 3.5e has rules for that. In 3.5, if the water is at least 10 feet deep and you fall 20 feet, you're taking no damage. The next 20 feet up deal bludgeoning damage as usual, non-lethally. This, honestly, seems pretty fair. Much more fair than dealing 4d6 damage to an individual who falls into water from 40 feet up. This should help facilitate those kind of cliff-jumping, daring escapes that I'm sure your party has tried once or twice, increasing the drama at the table while reducing the kind of jarring mismatch between the rules and common sense. Of course, this is not the sort of homebrew rule that requires a big song and dance at session 0, like some other kind of more impactful homebrew rules. Heck, it doesn't even need to be a formalised rule that you memorise as a GM. Just having listened this far into the video, heard some common sense rules, and absorbed things via osmosis will probably be enough for you to make a good common sense ruling at your table that may or may not be based upon the rules we've discussed here. After all, players are constantly wanting to do cool stuff. And if you run up against the edge case of a player wanting to jump into water, well then 3.5e has your back. It even has rules for cliff diving in particular, jumping intentionally into water, perhaps not under duress. A successful, well, in 5e I'd say acrobatics check of DC 15 means that you're taking no damage from the first 50 feet of an intentional dive into water. Every subsequent 50 feet, that DC is going to increase by 5. With the current high diving record being 192 feet, which resulted in some leg damage, this seems fairly congruent with 5e's superheroic design. You'd need a DC 30 athletics check to get away from that dive with no damage. That's falling. At least those are the rules that I felt were most useful for patching over some of the cracks that 5e leaves us. Of course, you can develop your own entire homebrew falling rule kit, but knowing that these things are out there in system reference documents, easily searchable, is just much, much less taxing on your effort as a DM. If you have a computer at the table and you simply search up the relevant rule from the relevant edition, you can have ready-made rulings for this rather controversial and often quite lethal aspect of the game that is underrepresented in the rules discussion. I hope, at least, that this discussion has helped you think about falling a little more, or perhaps a little differently. Or, if you didn't know, has at least alerted you to the optional extra falling rules in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, which I feel like a lot of people might have missed. In any case, let me know if you use any different systems, or you try this one in your games in the comments. I'd really appreciate it. And if you've made it this far in the video, I would massively appreciate if you subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to grow it as big as I can and build a community of people who are interested in the same stuff I am. So, if you can subscribe, that'd be amazing. With that said though, I'm Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master, and I'll see you in the next video.